Dr. Gaulden, so good to have you today, man.
Good to have you, Dr.
Our resident Old Testament expert.
Yeah, well, the expert part's debatable.
Well, the funniest thing you told me is that there's a papyri plant on campus.
It is.
I asked around, and a lot of people have come to discover this. And
yeah, I had nothing to do with it, honestly. Robbie Waddell, one of our professors, came up with this idea, and he's always creative, and he got it approved legally and got it planted down there. And then we've demonstrated how it's made.
And so it's down by Lake Bonnie?
Right by one of the lakes, not the big one in the front, but the back lake.
And you've made paper out of this?
It has been done. I haven't personally done it, but some students have.
Well,
it's pretty easy.
Yeah, we should do it sometime.
Yeah, you just cut it up and it looks like lasagna.
Okay.
You lay it out, you wet it, make it like dough, flip it over, do the same thing, and they let it dry and cut it, and it would be paper.
And this is what was used in Egypt?
Yeah, and Egypt did it. They were the bulk of it, and then they would glue it together and roll it. And to make chapters of the scrolls, they didn't have the concept of a book. They would put a seal there with clay and seal it. And then if you had 7 chapters, you'd have 7 seals. Right. So like later in the New Testament, I saw a scroll with 7 seals. It was 7 chapters.
Got it.
See how that's worked.
Yeah.
That
interesting.
Concept.
Yeah.
And so you rarely wrote it on the outside of the scroll. And you can see it with my hand turning. But it's interesting that these little things give you an indication. But Ezekiel said God had so much to say of how bad they were doing, he wrote on the inside and outside. And John says the same thing.
So this is how archaeology brings the text to life.
Yeah, it just brings thousands, not hundreds, thousands of insight into the scripture like that.
Well, first, tell me where your interest in archaeology began. You've pastored in South Carolina.
Yeah.
You had a thriving church that was there.
Yeah.
And were you interested in archaeology at the time?
Well, I remember it instantly when it happened. I was a student here. It was my last year, and the Biblical Archaeology Review magazine launched. And it was a little less, it was academic, but whereas the other academic archaeology was very rigorous, you almost had to have a graduate degree even to read them. This one had full colors. It was sort of bridging between scholarship and the average person. And I got it, and I bought every copy for decades and kept up with it. And then I started studying, going to graduate school, and went to Israel. Part of my DMin was done in Israel on Herod the Great's palace. Mm-hmm. And I was privileged to work with the top scholar. And Herod was probably the greatest builder in the ancient world. Some say better than the pyramids, which a case can be made for that.
You're kidding.
No, because the pyramids, the largest stones in the pyramid were 40 tons. Herod had some over 650 tons.
One stone?
Yeah. 40 versus 650. That's some of the largest, if not the largest.
What was he building with those size of stones?
He basically tripled the size of Solomon's temple. Okay. And so in order to do it, he had to go out over a valley and build a huge retention wall and then fill it in and make it level. So it took those gargantuan stones for the base. They're still there. It's the top area that eventually had 1.5 million stones. And eventually that part, literally, as Christ prophesied it was gone. But those underpinning stones are still there. The quarry was uphill, and they would quarry the stones and get them on rollers and roll them down into place. That's how they did it.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So back to your story.
Oh, but anyway, I was a senior here. And it came, and I just fell in love with it. It was really supernatural, too. It was sociologically, all of that. So much was being discovered that backed up the scriptures. A group we called the minimalists. It was a movement for 100, 150 years that minimized the Bible. This is not true. This is not true. There was no such person as King David, etc. Well, suddenly they find Tel Dan, they found the house of David mentioned. The Moabite stone, the house of David. Pharaoh Shashak talks about coming into Israel through the mountains of David. Then a female archaeologist discovers the palace of David, and on and on. So it's just countless things, literally thousands of things like that. So the minimalist movement is basically dead. It has no.
Was it killed by archaeology then?
It was killed by it ate a lot of dirt.
So no matter, I like what you did there.
We need a coffee, right?
Sorry, right. So the more they discovered from archaeology, the more it minimalized the minimalist movement.
Yeah, and here's Dr. Palmer. Here's the beautiful part. It is like a fire hydrant going all in one direction. The Bible is the historical framework is true. For instance, there's 19 kings in the Assyrian Empire. 19 when Israel was split, 19 kings in the north, about 19 kings or a queen in the south. We have almost something on every one of them. There's a few we don't, but we have their seal. We have something they're mentioned in an Assyrian document, or something's discovered, or a jar. This is owned by King Hezekiah, whatever,
So it's no matter, the more they keep searching, the more artifacts they find to show that, like you said, the historical framework of the text is in fact accurate and correct.
If you don't mind, I'll tell you one of the most phenomenal I've ever heard was just discovered.
Let's hear it.
And Hezekiah, when he took over the kingdom, he went into a great reform. He lists all the things he did, tore down the high places, on and on and on. And in it, he mentioned something called the Nehushtan he tore down. It was built by Moses when they were in the wilderness 700 years earlier. And people were bit by serpents. They put it on a cross, a brass serpent. And God chose to heal people if they lifted it up and looked upon it in certain cases. It's carried into the New Testament for Christ if he be lifted up. But anyway, he says that he destroyed it, word for word, in the Bible. Well, they found just a year or so ago the actual records of Hezekiah, some of them, and they found that document. And you lay it right beside the Bible, Dr. Palmer. It is virtually word to word, and it says the Nehushtan and all of that. So it not only is kind of confirming Hezekiah's document, phenomenal, but you leapfrog back about 700 years and you realize that story of Moses doing that is not just some make-believe.
Yeah, history records it.
Yeah, and so that does a lot for people's faith, because if we don't have that, we almost have a tooth fairy or Santa Claus, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer.
The Easter Bunny.
Who's going to believe in all that mess?
Yeah. No, that's so the historical framework, or the historical discoveries that we're finding through archaeology, are showing us that we have more than something that's made up and make-believe. We have something that's just as real as World War I history, World War II history.
Conservatively, we have 100 people we know, beyond any question, that are mentioned in the Old and New Testament. But the reality is about 300. We find they're called bullas. They would have when they sealed those scrolls, that seal was called a bulla because it sort of has a bulge to it. Usually made out of clay, generally, sometimes wax. But if they fit into the right environment, they would become hardened, almost like ceramic. And especially when the palace was burned by the Babylonians, all of those officials, their bullas were sealed. Well, Jeremiah mentions at least 12 of them or more that have been discovered because they were all burned and sealed. And these unusual names that you read about in Jeremiah, we have those seals. And so we know that was the palace. That's how we know that was King David's palace that had remained, if I'm making sense.
So talk to me about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, individuals say this is one of the most important archaeological discoveries that's ever been made. Because on social media, there's so much talk about historical accuracy of the Bible, and people that are dissenters or non-believers, they point to historical accuracies, or actually say they point to historical inaccuracies in the text. And they say, well, the Bible can't be true because there's all these historical inaccuracies. What did the Dead Sea Scrolls do to confirm our faith?
And that's a brilliant question, because prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls being discovered, our oldest Hebrew manuscripts were only 1,000 years old. They were, the only reason we had those that old wasn't because they couldn't have existed longer, but the Jewish people took the same approach to a scroll that we take in the military toward an American flag. And if an American flag is tattered, we don't preserve it, we burn it out of respect. Now, it's hard to believe we respectfully have a ceremony where we burn the American flag. I grew up a Boy Scout, and we were taught all that. So the Jewish scribes would burn those scrolls out of respect. It's hard for us to think like that. But our oldest was 1,000 years. So the minimalists saying, well, you're talking about something that's over 1,000 years plus older than that. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we found them now, instead of going back 1,000 years, 2,200 years. And we could compare that 2,200-year scroll to one that was 1,000 years. Does it make sense? And the scroll of Isaiah is a good illustration. And it was almost like, I'm exaggerating, like somebody made a Xerox copy of it.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. And one of the things, there was a Jewish man that came to know Christ, and he gave his benefit for what led him to Christ was the Dead Sea Scrolls. He said that he had always been told, he was an older man, that was the Christians added that. Isaiah 53, he'll be wounded for our transgressions, that wasn't in the original scroll. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered 200 plus years before Christ, there it was, word for word.
Word for word.
That the Messiah will be wounded for our transgressions. He'll be bruised for our iniquity.
Yeah.
Chastisement of our sin that's going to be upon him.
So then when there's individuals that point to textual variants in various manuscripts, and they haven't studied textual criticism and how it actually works. But when there are variants between manuscripts, that doesn't necessarily suggest that the manuscript itself is defunct of any kind.
No, and here's what I say cohesively. Cohesively means all together. When we take all the manuscripts we have and we really compare them, for the most part, we have a very 99.8%, I think, ability to reconstruct pretty close to what the original was. What we haven't done is created that manuscript. What we still do is use whatever manuscript that translation's based on. But those variants are really not that crucial when one studies it in entirety.
Yeah, it feels like I've studied textual criticism to an extent in my graduate studies, and the way that dissenters and non-believers are treating variants is something that's more serious than what they actually are.
That's right.
They're treating it as a disqualifier, when in essence, like you say, there's a cohesiveness about variants that you have to take into consideration. Varying from manuscript to manuscript. And just because there's a variant doesn't necessarily mean that the manuscript itself is defunct. Right.
And you're much better at the New Testament than this and me. But as you know, we have so many thousands of manuscripts of the Greek New Testament that pretty much we can get a pretty good solid handle. And for all practices of faith and practice, we have a reliable text.
Yeah, we have a good system. It works out. I mean, it's getting us closer. And so the idea is, the Bible is inaccurate. Well, we have more archaeology, more manuscripts suggesting the validity of the New Testament and the Old Testament text than we do any other document in history. And what else are people looking for? Your Old Testament teaching has been so impactful at Southeastern University. I mean, you've been here for how many years, Dr. Gaulden?
As a professor, I've been here 18, but I was a student here. I hate to even tell you how many years ago. But so I have been told, I'm not the oldest faculty member, but I've been told that I am the oldest alumni faculty member. That's
Got
a
it.
distinction. So it makes sense.
So there's a little
Actually,
statistic for that.
Yeah, like Dr. Hackett is, he's a legend, Methuselah or ancient of days, but he didn't actually graduate from here. Mm-hmm. So I edge him out that way, even though he's a decade older.
What has been the most rewarding experience about teaching Old Testament to our students that are here?
The biggest one is a wrong concept they had of God. So many of them will tell me at the beginning they had a concept that the God of the New Testament was a God of grace. But the God of the Old Testament was a God that was harsh. And so as we go through it and we look behind it and we see the thousands of times His mercy, they often the tears will come to their eyes, that revelation. And we kind of balance it out a little bit. I use the illustration. What if out here a person who lost their mind had abducted two little children, a cute little girl, boy, and was going to burn them out here on the soccer field? And we received a text in the class that this is going on in real time right now. Would any of us stay in this classroom? And they all say no. What would you do? We'd all run out there and stop him. Mm-hmm. And I said, that was what God was having to do. The Canaanite religion had so influenced the Jewish people, they were sacrificing children. In 100%, and this is hard to believe, 100% of the Canaanite altars, the archaeologists have found charred bones of boys and girls. So God had to intervene. The beautiful part was once they were taken into Babylon and returned, they never again returned to idolatry. And that shows up not only biblical, the Bible says that, but you can see the stratas where we find the idols everywhere. Babylonian destruction, they come back.
But what was it about them being in Babylon that never allowed them to return to idolatry?
The way I would use it today in a 21st century metaphor is it's like a person that had cancer and it was catastrophic and a person was going to have major surgery. I had a friend of mine, she just recently had surgery over 7 hours. Well, it had to be done or she wasn't going to keep on going. Because it's done, she's going to live many more years. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And in a sense, Jeremiah prophesied that Babylon would last 70 years. And it did, even though he died probably 10, 20 years before that. It lasted exactly 70 years. And Ezekiel says that's what's going to happen as the benefit of this. When you return, you never will go back to idolatry. And they didn't. If anything, they went too far the other way, and that's where the Pharisees and all that kind of they became a little hyper, religious.
Yeah, you shared testimonies to me about students that have been in your class. Can you think of anything in particular that there's a time where being in class was impactful for a student? Or
I was a student that actually didn't even have me normally. And I had been offered a phenomenal job. It was a lot more money and the magnitude of it, the way the world, was a lot. It's just, without going into detail, it would be foolish not to have accepted it. And I was offered it, okay? And so I went to church over here at Family Worship. First time I ever visited, and I got there early, first service, and I prayed, Lord, I'm facing one of the most complex decisions I've ever made. And Pastor Reggie stood up, and he almost never prophesies over anybody. I later found out, and he stopped, and he said, the Lord says you're facing one of the most complex decisions. It was word for word what I just prayed. Big old tears running, and he said, God's going to direct you with this decision. Well, the next day, a student came in, and he had graduated, and he said, Dr. Gaulden, can I tell you a testimony? He said, I never had you, but for many years, I was plagued with thoughts of suicide. He said it wasn't because I was depressed. He said I couldn't understand it. I would have these thoughts, pressing thoughts all the time. Take your life, kill yourself, and he didn't know why. He never even talked to anybody about it. And he said, one day I stepped into your class and I just decided to sit down. And that day, the presence of God was so powerful that day. He said it lifted off of me. And it's been years now, and it never has come back. And, that taught me a lot, that preparation is important. The preparation of a faculty member, all of that, our study and all of that. But it is not by might. It's not by our power. It's His presence, And that moment I knew, less pay, all of that, there's no price one can pay for that. And I knew. And that was many years ago.
And what is it about the presence of God that has a way of changing our hearts that our own words can't seem to adjust in people?
Well, and I've heard that, what the presence of God can do. Probably the greatest physical miracle I ever witnessed occurred February 3rd, 1998. And a few months prior to this miracle of a child being born blind, made instantly whole. It got caught on film, and I got her photo upstairs in my office. But I had a dream, and I saw miracles like one reads in the New Testament. And the Lord spoke to me in the dream, said, "Son, you're going to see this very soon." And I was pastoring a church. And right after that, a man named Rajan invited me, he and his wife, to go to India with them. And so 13 Americans, we went. And this night, the meeting was over with, and we had dismissed, and they said, "Would you pray for this girl?" And then, so we prayed for this little girl, and suddenly she could see. You could tell she was blind, and the crowd was going crazy. They knew her. Her name was Raja Lakshmi. She was 6 years old. When she was 5, she was put in the blind school. And so I thought, well, maybe she already had partial sight, and maybe the interpreter's getting mixed up. So I went and got the medical doctor, and they say it's a miracle, but did she have partial sight? He said, "No, Doc, she was born blind." And they tested her. She had 20/20 vision. Now, the muscles in her eye had atrophy because she had never used them. The Lord didn't heal that because over time that healed itself. Mm-hmm. I learned something about God. He will do what we can't do, but those muscles, you're going right. to fix those yourself. And her parents came and got her. And now she's in her early 30s, married, and has her own children. Yeah. We kept up with her for many years.
Yeah, so much of scholarship, because on one end we're talking scholarship and archaeology and something that's intellectual. But on the next hand, we're talking something spiritual, mm-hmm. something that's pragmatic and mm-hmm. that's tangible and palpable.
Yeah.
What's the importance of having both of those combined into an expression mm-hmm. of yourself as a professor or as a believer? Because scholarship has a tendency to go to this high-minded loftiness that's ineffective. And then there's also the tendency where, you have a lot of spirituality, but it doesn't fervently
right.
say
it's light, yeah.
It's light.
It's like a cotton candy. We used to have a term here, spooky wooky. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Cotton candy is a good description.
Well, what is it?
Cotton candy is a good description.
Cotton candy, yeah. And in both extremes, I think are deadly, really. I mean, Hosea said, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." And then yet, who did Christ struggle with the most sometimes? It was that dead arm of the faith where all they had was the letter.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the Spirit. And the Sadducees, who didn't believe in miracles and the presence of God and all that, he says, you don't even know the Scriptures nor the power of a God. And the way I took that was, once a person experiences something that's supernatural, that's the real deal, they know. It strengthens their faith in Scriptures. It solidifies things. There's that healthy blend that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I think probably more than any ambition we have, we should strive for that and to actually live it,
Yeah.
Because Christ said, if you hear my words and you do them, you'll be like the house on the rock. If you hear my words and you don't do them, mm-hmm. we're just sand,
Yeah.
And he said, and when the storms come, then they will come for all of us. One will stand and one won't.
Yeah. Maybe a pastor's listening right now and they're asking themselves, how much of a scholar do I need to be? How much work do I need to put into my education? What's a roundabout answer for that?
Well, and I think that's good. And maybe I can answer just my own illustration. When I was a pastor, I worked real hard at the pulpit. I wouldn't think I was the most gifted, but I don't think any pastor outworked me when the pulpit, because Paul said you should work hard at preaching. It's the same Greek word where he talks about the hardworking farmer. It means to work to the weariness of the flesh, really. But at the same time, I was blessed to be near a marvelous school. And so I just paced myself and I started studying, and I was privileged to study under one of the world's greatest Old Testament scholars. He's like a hidden gem, Dr. William Kirkendall. And he had studied under the father of archaeology, William Albright, who was the first to say, when he saw the Dead Sea Scrolls, let him know what it was. And so they both are gone now. But I started it as a pastor. Does that make sense? And so I encourage every pastor, ongoing, a church board should, for me, they financially took care of a course every semester for me.
Yeah.
And before you know it, it adds up.
Yeah, it does. That's how I did my education. I was, my graduate study, I was pastoring. And I was taking it one course at a time because I didn't have all the free time to study. But like you said, over time, it began to add up. I guess my rule of thumb is that for pastors and leaders, try to take advantage of the time that you have and make the most of whatever availability you have to education. If you have the time and if you have the money, take advantage of adding to yourself and look at it as something that plays into your development. Because if you're spending time in prayer daily, if you're with the people of God, because I think that's essential, is oftentimes scholars begin to study and they leave the people of God.
Yeah.
They divorce themselves from the church.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, see you guys later. And they go into the ivory tower and they're stuck up there. But what's beneficial to our scholarship is being around the sheep.
Yeah, right.
Being around the flock, because that keeps us in remembrance of why we're doing this. We do scholarship so that we can serve the people of God and so that we can minister to them more effectively, more accurately.
Yeah, and probably because you did pace yourself with this scholarship. And fortunately, I was too. I didn't take too much at one time. And I encourage pastors, you'll be wanting to get through the degree, but it's the process more than the degree.
Yeah, and one of the best ways I looked at it was, because now I'm in higher ed because I love it so much, but back then it was just a notion of, should I do this, should I not? Yeah. But I thought, if I could enjoy this like I enjoy a hobby, then reading and doing homework will feel like going fishing. And it did.
Yeah.
And so because I didn't have so much.
Same thing with me. Yeah. And my congregation would say, why are you taking Egyptian hieroglyphs? You don't ever speak about it behind the pulpit. And I would say, I don't know why. I said, the Lord's put it in my heart. Well, now that I've had Hebrew and Greek and all those things, now I use them, occasionally. Or at least it helps me.
What was that class like, Egyptian hieroglyphs?
I found it hard. Now, Dr. Kirkendall, I said, you're lying, I'm teasing him, he would say it's easy, but it was not easy. It had like 4 different mechanisms to make words, and it had thousands of determinatives, they call it, and you had to actually draw it. And I was, at the time, not super artistic, and he was always making fun of mine. So
in Egyptian hieroglyphs, this is how you interpret what's in Egyptian, like on a wall somewhere in a pyramid?
Yeah, and now I still know how it works. Now, I don't use it much anymore. Part of it was really a spiritual reason. After a while, almost every other page, you're praying to a god or something, and I got tired of that. So, but I said, well, Lord, I know how it works, and I can get to it real quick. And I have 2 friends that are, PhDs in it, and so I call them if I have a question just to double check. But yeah, it opened my eyes to how it worked. Like when the Pharaoh Shishak's monument, they found King David's name. I was able to read that. And when I would start going to Egypt, Pharaoh Ramesses II, his son, has a big stela. It's a monument about tall as that door there. And down at the bottom, it's the first time Israel is mentioned in this in hieroglyphs. So I was able
the first time in all of Egypt it's mentioned.
Yeah, the oldest that we know.
Yeah.
Now, there is a theory up the Nile. It's a new development that there may be an older one, but definitely without any debate, this one was around 1200 something BC. And he talks about going into Israel and, in that area. Go ahead.
Is there any archaeology that suggests the plagues that we find in Exodus?
Yeah, there's a series of them where the Egyptians record these things, and one tends to envelop the other. So God tends to use the supernatural and the natural together. He's the author of both. And when I was in India seeing these miracles, they all occurred right near where Thomas the disciple had been martyred. And it was just an interesting experience for me. But I had a sensation there. I know it's going to sound spooky here, but it was almost like I saw a bubble, two bubbles one day. And it was like God showed me in that spiritual realm that what we call the natural and supernatural, for him are just really close. He just has to shift it a bit. Does it make sense? So they have records of where the water was polluted, turns red, the frogs come out, they die, the lice, etc., etc. So that has occurred in history, if that makes sense. A number of places in times. But the uniqueness of the narrative with Exodus takes on a higher quality.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine being in Egypt has to be something that's surreal when you're studying biblical studies.
The size of the pyramids are phenomenal.
Yeah, what do you think those pyramids were even about? Any idea? Were they tombs of a pharaoh? Or
there's all kinds of theories, but they definitely were tombs. And you can crawl inside of them. I've crawled inside of them. If you don't have claustrophobia, I don't have it.
Like the Pyramid of Giza, you can go in there?
Yeah, you can crawl inside. It's a tunnel, and now you got to stoop. And you can't have claustrophobia because you go down these tunnels, and then it opens up into the big room. And it definitely, that's all it was. But it was gargantuan.
Would those pyramids have been around during the time of the Hebrews being in Israel?
It would not have. Those would have been earlier. Okay. Earlier as well. So there's two major views on how we date the Exodus. One's an earlier view. That's the one I lean to. And then the later view. And there's a gap of about 200 years. But if I can say this respectfully of those who hold to the second view, the preponderance of evidence is almost overwhelming the other way. I'm working on a book on that right now. Yeah. And so that it fits the biblical narrative, fits the archaeology much better, fits countless things in the Bible with that. So,
in speaking of archaeology in Egypt, then, has there been any archaeological excavation in the sea where Moses parted it, the Red Sea? Or?
Yeah, a little bit. And here again, there's two major views. One is right up along the coastline between Egypt and Israel. That's one view. Yam Suf is the area that it was called in the Hebrew Bible, but in Egyptian it was called that, Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And the Bible says that a heavy wind, strong wind, blew all night long, and it pushed the water back, and the water congealed, meaning it somehow stopped. I don't know if the mud did it, what did it. Then the chariots got stuck in there. There were only 600 chariots. And then the water comes back on them, drowns.
So it wouldn't have been like a parting in the movie Prince of Egypt?
I don't think so. But now in that particular area, even down here in Tampa, when the hurricanes come in, a hurricane has like a right hook. It's turning right all the time. It hits you front with a jab, but it's got a wicked right. And as the hurricane comes on in, the winds come back and push the water out of the Tampa Bay, and Tampa Bay's dry.
So got it. So it pushes it away.
Yeah, and you can walk in Tampa Bay sometimes right immediately after a hurricane for hundreds of yards.
No kidding.
Yeah, I've seen it myself. So the Bible says he used a strong wind, and a lot of Christians miss that. And then there's another view down along the Red Sea itself, sort of what down at a lot. I don't have a map in front of me, but that one also is called Yam Suf. And so those are two views. Good people try to make an argument for both. But we do know, I was trying to think which Pharaoh it was. I saw it the other day. But anyway, he had a Hebrew a slave escape, and he was going to what we call Canaan, and he went along those bitter lake areas. That's where later, in more recent times, the Suez Canal was dug through there 150 years ago or so. And even then, they said sometimes the wind blows those shallow lakes, it gets dangerous, and it had a whole history there. So I lean toward that one probably the best.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean I'm right on that, but
yeah,
that it makes sense to me.
Yeah, do you think that's what we do sometimes with the Old Testament, is that we kind of have our own ideas of how things are, and then we import that into our reading of the Scripture, and then we come to find out it probably didn't happen this way, maybe to our disappointment, in a sense.
And most of the Bible, was translated right about 500 years ago in English, roughly. They really didn't know Hebrew that well. They've done a great job with it even back then. They did it. I would say there's 3 or 4 things they didn't do well. One is when they're numbering people that are going to fight. They use the word thousand. Now, the Hebrew word is eleph, E-L-E-P-H, from which we get our word elephant. Its root word means large.
Yeah.
So when it was applied to an animal, the largest mammal walking was an elephant.
Yeah.
The word elephant is a Hebrew word, really.
How about that?
And that's something. Because Israel's really attached to Africa, actually. So, but when it's applied to a family, let's take your last name is Palmer. Your immediate family may be your mother and dad and siblings and you. But if all your cousins and uncles and aunts come, we would say in English, the clan. Well, in the Hebrew Bible, that's the word Eleph, the clans of Edom.
Okay.
Does it make sense? But when it's used militarily, and the oldest place we ever find it is a small military team of 5 to 10 males. They're called Elephs. So
it's not a specific number. It's just a quantity.
It's a military term. And even today, when we talk about platoons and battalions, the military uses it loosely. They don't use it precisely. So basically, when he's numbering them to fight, he said there were 600 Elephs. Well, if that's 1,000, wow, that the nation had to be 2 million. If it's that smaller number, we're probably talking about less than 20,000. The archaeology shows that the Canaanites were about 40,000 people at the time of the conquest. It shows that a group less than 20,000 conquered them because it shows the burned area. It shows stratas of pig bones. The Canaanites ate pigs. Destruction. Whoever conquered them didn't eat pigs. No bones. But it shows a much smaller group. And the oldest place we find that word for Eleph is in the communication from the Canaanites and King Tut's father, Akhenaten, saying, help us. These troops are Elephs of Habarus. They're conquering the land. So we made that one as a big one to rethink. So when we're thinking of those military battles, we probably are looking at much smaller numbers.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
But the percents are correct.
So do you think that as we've gotten to know Hebrew better, that our modern translation, do you think our modern translations are more accurate?
And I would say most scholars, liberal or conservative, would say, that it was a much smaller, that Hebrew word probably should be a better thought like that.
Yeah. Dr. Gaulden, I want to take one of your classes here at SCU.
Yeah, we have all, and I hear yours are great too. So you're right before me. So.
Yeah, I come right out.
Students come out and they're talking about it. So
they go from learning about nihilism to learning about the Old Testament. So
yeah, they straight. And it's the weird thing. I feel I get to teach on the freshman level, upperclassman level, occasionally the master level, occasionally PhD level. And it is fun.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, we're glad to have you, and you're so insightful. So thanks for chatting with me today.
It's an honor. It's an honor.
Yeah.